Johnny Carson was the king of late-night television for 3 decades, a master of comedic timing, wit, and calm professionalism. He could handle almost any guest with charm and poise, but that doesn't mean he liked them all. Behind Carson's smooth delivery was a man who valued spontaneity, respect for the show's rhythm, and genuine chemistry. When a guest disrupted that flow or pushed boundaries too far, Carson noticed, and he didn't forget. While he rarely broke character on camera, behind the scenes, there were celebrities he reportedly dreaded inviting back. Some clashed with his humor, some challenged his authority, and others simply made things uncomfortable. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the celebrities Johnny Carson couldn't stand. You might be surprised who made the list. Bob Hope. At first glance, Bob Hope and Johnny Carson seemed like a dream duo, two titans of comedy sharing the same stage. But behind the scenes, their relationship was far from warm. Carson, known for his razor-sharp wit and masterful ability to keep conversations natural and engaging, reportedly dreaded having Bob Hope on The Tonight Show. Why? Because every Hope appearance felt less like a conversation and more like a choreographed performance. By the time Hope became a regular guest, his style had grown dated. He relied heavily on cue cards, scripted jokes, and a team that would fax pre-written lines to The Tonight Show producers in advance. That rigid approach clashed with Carson's preference for spontaneity. Instead of a lively exchange, Carson was reduced to feeding Hope setups for punchlines, turning the legendary host into little more than a glorified straight man. What frustrated Carson even more was that there was never a sense of real dialogue. Hope didn't banter, didn't riff, and didn't veer from the script. Every line had a purpose, and that purpose was usually to promote his latest special or appearance. According to insiders, it felt like Hope was operating as a one-man promotional machine, not a guest trying to entertain or share something genuine. Carson reportedly said that interviewing Hope was like doing a commercial, and it wasn't far from the truth. Even when Hope had nothing of substance to plug, producers still felt obligated to book him because of his legendary status in Hollywood. That obligation, combined with Hope's refusal to adapt to modern formats, turned each appearance into a tedious, uncomfortable segment for Carson. While the audience might have chuckled out of loyalty or nostalgia, Carson's body language often betrayed his feelings. You could almost see the tension in his posture, the forced laughs, and the urgency to wrap things up. Unlike other comedic guests who could roll with Carson's improv style, Bob Hope felt like an immovable statue, unfunny, untouchable, and unyielding. Joan Rivers. Few relationships in late-night television history were as complex and ultimately heartbreaking as the one between Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers. Their story began with admiration and mentorship, but ended in complete silence and betrayal. For years, Rivers was one of Carson's favorite guests. She was sharp, fearless, and funny, exactly the kind of presence that thrived on The Tonight Show. So much so that Carson handpicked her as one of his most frequent guest hosts, often calling her one of the few comics who could truly match his wit. Behind the scenes, many believed Rivers was being groomed as Carson's successor. She was a regular fixture in the rotation and held her own with guests and audiences alike. But in 1986, everything changed. Fox offered Joan her own late-night talk show, The Late Show starring Joan Rivers, a groundbreaking offer that would make her the first woman to host a late-night program on a major network. Rather than call Carson personally to tell him the news, Rivers allowed the announcement to be made public without reaching out. Carson saw this not as a business decision, but a deep personal betrayal. To him, Rivers had not only stepped into the competitive ring, but had done so without the courtesy of a phone call. According to Rivers, she tried to call him multiple times afterward, but he refused to take her calls. He never spoke to her again. The fallout was immediate and severe. Carson banned Rivers from ever appearing on The Tonight Show again, a ban that remained in place throughout his lifetime. Even after Carson retired, Jay Leno continued to enforce it out of respect for his predecessor. It wasn't until 2014, nearly 30 years later, that Joan Rivers finally returned to the show during Jimmy Fallon's tenure. What made the situation especially bitter was that Rivers had genuinely admired Carson. She often credited him for launching her career. But Carson, a man known for his emotional reserve and loyalty, viewed her decision as a direct betrayal. The warmth that once defined their on-screen chemistry turned into cold silence off-camera. Their rift became one of the most infamous feuds in talk show history, a cautionary tale about loyalty, legacy, and the unforgiving nature of show business. Wayne Newton. Wayne Newton and Johnny Carson had one of the most uncomfortable feuds in The Tonight Show's long history. While Carson was known for his dry wit and gentle ribbing of celebrities, Newton became a frequent target of his jokes, particularly ones aimed at his flamboyant appearance and polished stage persona. What Carson may have seen as harmless comedy, Newton saw as something much more personal. Carson often poked fun at Newton's high voice, his glitzy Las Vegas performances, and his perceived lack of masculinity. At a time when image meant everything, Newton was building his brand as a serious performer and didn't appreciate becoming late-night punchline material. Most celebrities shrugged off Carson's jokes, understanding the game. But Newton didn't play along. He took offense, and he took action. According to multiple accounts, Newton reached his breaking point and decided to confront Carson directly. In a moment that became the stuff of backstage legend, Newton stormed into Carson's office and delivered an intimidating warning. The jokes had to stop, or there would be consequences. It wasn't just a verbal scolding. Newton reportedly used his physical presence to make the message unmistakably clear. Carson, who was known for his cool demeanor, was visibly shaken. This confrontation changed things. While Carson rarely backed down from a feud, he toned down his jokes about Newton from that point forward. But the damage was done. The tension between the two lingered, and Newton's appearances on The Tonight Show became rare, and always slightly awkward when they did happen. Carson, who preferred playful banter over real conflict, found Newton's seriousness off-putting. Unlike other guests who leaned into the show's comedic tone, Newton seemed to bring drama to the stage and discomfort behind it. While both men maintained public professionalism, insiders say Carson was never fully comfortable around him again. This feud revealed something important about Carson's style. He could joke with you, but if you couldn't take the joke, things got complicated fast. Fred Rogers. Some guests left Johnny Carson unsure of how to respond, not because they were combative or unpredictable, but because they operated on an entirely different emotional frequency. One of the most well-known was a soft-spoken television icon adored by millions of children and parents alike. On paper, their meeting was historic, two legends of broadcast television sharing a stage. But in practice, their styles clashed in a way that made the interviews feel awkward and strained. Carson reportedly found him to be one of the most challenging guests ever to appear on The Tonight Show. Carson thrived on quick wit, sarcasm, and playful teasing. His interviews were built on spontaneity and energy. Fred Rogers, by contrast, was soft-spoken, patient, and deeply earnest. He didn't play along with jokes or banter. He wasn't trying to entertain in a traditional sense. Instead, he spoke from the heart about childhood education, emotional wellness, and kindness. And while these were admirable messages, they left little room for Carson's trademark humor. During Rogers' appearances, Carson found himself unable to crack jokes without appearing insensitive. He couldn't poke fun or steer the conversation into comedic territory without disrupting Rogers' serious tone. The interviews often felt slow, and the rhythm that Carson relied on was completely absent. Behind the scenes, it was reportedly clear. Carson respected Rogers deeply, but he didn't enjoy having him on. Another issue was that Rogers' presence didn't align with the show's adult, late-night audience. His calm demeanor and moral messaging, while powerful on public television, simply didn't mesh with Carson's fast-paced, entertainment-first format. The contrast created a kind of awkward standoff. Carson, the entertainer, and Rogers, the moral guide. While no animosity existed between them, their opposing energies made for an undeniably strained dynamic, one that left Carson quietly hoping the next guest would bring back the laughs. Charlton Heston. This guy was Hollywood royalty, a commanding figure known for epic roles in films like Ben-Hur and The Ten Commandments. But when it came to late-night television, Heston's larger-than-life persona didn't translate well. Johnny Carson, who preferred quick-witted, flexible guests, reportedly found Heston difficult to engage with, and, quite frankly, exhausting to interview. The problem wasn't personal animosity, it was tone. Heston carried himself with a formality that made relaxed conversation nearly impossible. He spoke with the weight of a statesman, often veering into long-winded monologues about his films, politics, or beliefs. For Carson, who thrived on lively back-and-forth dialogue, this made for a slow and heavy interview. Adding to the discomfort was Heston's serious, sometimes humorless demeanor. He rarely joked or let his guard down, and when Carson would try to insert some levity, Heston either missed the cue or didn't respond at all. The natural flow Carson relied on came to a screeching halt whenever Heston took over the segment with a detailed explanation or firm opinion. Their political differences may have also played a role. Heston became increasingly vocal in his conservative views, especially later in his career as president of the NRA. Carson, who avoided overt politics, likely found this uncomfortable, particularly given the show's broad appeal and focus on entertainment, not ideology. Although Heston's visits were always respectful and professional, they were rarely enjoyable for Carson. The intense gravitas Heston brought to the set simply didn't mesh with the show's tone. To Carson, those interviews were less a conversation and more a lecture, and that wasn't what The Tonight Show was built for. Harry Belafonte. He was more than a singer and actor. He was a civil rights icon. His talent and legacy were undeniable, but for Johnny Carson, Belafonte presented a unique challenge as a guest on The Tonight Show. While Carson respected Belafonte's artistry and activism, their conversations often felt tense and mismatched, largely due to the serious topics Belafonte brought to the table. Carson built his show around humor, escapism, and lighthearted conversation. Belafonte, on the other hand, used his platform to raise awareness about racial injustice, poverty, and global humanitarian issues. When Belafonte appeared, the mood of the show often shifted dramatically. What was meant to be entertaining and funny could suddenly become serious, emotional, or even confrontational. Carson wasn't necessarily uncomfortable with meaningful discussions, but he preferred them to be brief and balanced with humor. Belafonte didn't operate that way. He spoke with passion and intensity, diving into weighty subjects that didn't allow Carson much room to steer the conversation back to comedy. This imbalance left Carson in an awkward spot. He couldn't cut him off without seeming dismissive, but he also couldn't engage in the way the audience had come to expect. Viewers tuning in for laughs sometimes felt caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. And though Carson remained respectful on the surface, behind the scenes, it was clear that Belafonte's appearances disrupted the usual rhythm of the show. Unlike other guests who played along with Carson's style, Belafonte demanded space for seriousness, a demand that didn't align with the light, late-night format. In the end, Carson didn't dislike Belafonte as a person, but as a guest, he found the experience draining. It wasn't a clash of personalities so much as a collision of purpose. Chevy Chase. Rising comedy stars didn't always translate into good guests, especially when they came with sharp edges. One such name from the 1970s skyrocketed to fame through biting satire and a brash public persona, which should have made him a perfect fit for The Tonight Show. But behind the scenes, Johnny Carson reportedly had little patience for his energy, attitude, and lack of warmth. Their chemistry never fully sparked, and the tension wasn't just on camera. The problem wasn't that Chase lacked humor. He was undeniably talented, but his brand of comedy leaned heavily into sarcasm, smugness, and sometimes outright arrogance. Carson, while known for his wit, preferred guests who brought a sense of humility or warmth to the interview. With Chase, the room often felt colder. He projected an air of superiority that clashed with Carson's more controlled, congenial style. On several occasions, Chase seemed less interested in engaging with Carson and more concerned with delivering clever lines or promoting himself. There was little sense of collaboration, no give and take, no playful banter. For a host like Carson, who thrived on rhythm and timing, this made the interview feel flat and frustrating. There were also whispers that Chase saw himself as Carson's eventual replacement. He was young, famous, and ambitious, everything a late-night network might look for in a next-generation host. Whether that was true or not, Carson was known to be wary of guests who appeared to angle for his throne. If he sensed ego or competition, his warmth quickly cooled. While Chase remained a welcome figure in the broader comedy world, he was not one of Carson's favorites. Their interviews were polite, but never joyful. For Carson, Chase represented a new kind of celebrity, one more concerned with image and edge than connection. And that made him an uncomfortable guest in the seat across from the king of late night. Frank Sinatra. Few entertainers could command a room quite like the man often called Old Blue Eyes. His appearances on The Tonight Show always drew attention, with viewers eager to see two legends side by side. But while the audience watched with admiration, Johnny Carson reportedly found these interviews far more tense than enjoyable. The trouble lay in the power dynamic. Sinatra wasn't just a guest, he was an icon with a long shadow. Known for his connections and charisma, he brought a certain edge to the show that left little room for Carson's usual playfulness. Where most guests welcomed his subtle jabs and teasing, Sinatra didn't. There was an unspoken understanding. Certain lines shouldn't be crossed. For Carson, a host who built his career on timing, wit, and pushing boundaries just enough, that was a problem. Controlling the pace of the interview also proved difficult. Sinatra liked things his way, and when he didn't, his mood could shift quickly. Carson, a man who valued structure and control on set, was forced to tread lightly, careful not to offend, but also trying not to appear deferential. The result was a cautious, often stilted exchange that felt more like a high-stakes dance than a genuine conversation. Their personalities didn't complement each other. Carson's reserved professionalism clashed with the swagger and bravado his guest brought to the stage. And though the respect was mutual, the energy between them never quite clicked. Viewers may have seen two legends sharing the screen, but Carson likely saw the countdown clock, eager to wrap up and move on to a guest who let the host actually host. Bette Midler. Some guests walked onto The Tonight Show and blended seamlessly into Johnny Carson's carefully curated rhythm. Others stole the spotlight and held onto it with flair. One of the most unforgettable was a performer who never did anything halfway, commanding attention from the second she stepped on stage. Carson appreciated strong talent, but even he struggled when a guest's presence threw off the delicate balance he worked so hard to maintain. Known for her theatrical style and emotionally charged performances, this particular entertainer had a tendency to dominate the moment. While the audience loved her boldness and unpredictability, Carson often found himself taking a back seat on his own show. Their most famous interaction came during Carson's final night as host in 1992. Her impromptu performance of "One for My Baby" brought him to tears and quickly became one of the most iconic moments in late-night history. But even that heartfelt tribute carried a layer of complexity, because in that moment, it felt like the host had been eclipsed by the guest. Carson valued control, pacing, and smooth transitions. He wanted his guests to shine, but not at the cost of the show's tone or structure. With someone so emotionally intense and performance-driven, that balance became difficult to maintain. It wasn't about ego, it was about rhythm. And when the rhythm faltered, Carson's discomfort became hard to hide. Despite their mutual respect, the chemistry between them was never effortless. She delivered some of the show's most talked about moments, but they came with tension. Beautiful, electric, and, for Carson, quietly exhausting. George Carlin. There was a time when one of the most legendary stand-up comics in American history was a regular on The Tonight Show. Early in his career, he was clean-cut, clever, and well within the boundaries of network television. But as the years passed, his comedy evolved, and with it, his compatibility with Johnny Carson rapidly declined. Carson, though sharp and occasionally edgy, crafted a show designed for mass appeal. He leaned into charm, broad relatability, and carefully managed tone. His guest, however, became a symbol of counterculture, rebellion, and pushing limits. As his routines grew more political, more profane, and more confrontational, the gap between the two entertainers widened until it became almost impossible to bridge. What once had been a strong rapport turned into a quiet distancing. Carson reportedly grew wary of bringing him on air, concerned that the unpredictability might throw the show off course. This guest didn't just tell jokes, he challenged institutions, called out hypocrisies, and occasionally flirted with topics too hot for late-night television. Carson wasn't one to scold or censor, but he did value control. And with a guest as unfiltered and boundary-pushing as this one, that control felt constantly at risk. The rebellious energy didn't fit with Carson's polished environment, where even controversy had to come, wrapped in a smile. By the end of Carson's reign, the two men had grown apart, professionally and creatively. While the comedian found a new audience in edgier spaces, Carson stuck with what he did best, keeping late-night television smooth, smart, and accessible. Shelley Winters. Some guests challenged Johnny Carson with their intellect, others with their unpredictability. Then there were those who simply overwhelmed the stage. And no one did that quite like this Oscar-winning actress. Known for her explosive energy and sharp tongue, she often turned a tightly run interview into pure chaos. Carson, ever the controlled and composed host, thrived on structure and subtlety. This guest, on the other hand, made her appearances feel more like unscripted drama than entertainment. She interrupted, talked over him, and took wild turns in conversation that left the famously unflappable host visibly irritated. There was no shortage of moments that tested his patience. On one occasion, she famously removed her shoe mid-interview and handed it to Carson, a bizarre and spontaneous act that threw off his rhythm completely. While some in the audience may have laughed at the absurdity, Carson was clearly uncomfortable, trying to bring the moment back under control without making the tension too obvious. She also had a reputation for steering interviews toward herself, often hijacking the conversation regardless of what Carson asked. That left little room for the kind of playful, back-and-forth exchange he enjoyed most. Instead of building comedic tension and release, the interviews often felt combative or erratic, something Carson quietly dreaded. Though she was undeniably talented and made for good television in her own way, her brashness clashed hard with Carson's smooth style. For a host who valued professionalism and pacing, her appearances were less of a performance and more of a storm. Some guests spark chaos for laughs, others bring it unintentionally. She did it unapologetically, and Johnny never quite knew what to do with that. Tom Snyder. It's not often that a talk show host finds himself interviewing another talk show host, but when it happened on The Tonight Show, the results weren't always smooth. One guest in particular, a bold and opinionated broadcaster in his own right, brought more friction than fun to the set. He was no stranger to being behind a desk. With a signature style that mixed intensity with unpredictability, he made his own show a late-night staple. But when he appeared as a guest opposite Johnny Carson, he didn't quite know how, or didn't care, to turn that off. Instead of slipping into the role of a relaxed guest, he often tried to take over. Carson prided himself on leading the conversation with polish and ease. This guest, however, was known for dominating discussions and veering into monologues. More than once, he would hijack the interview and shift the spotlight to himself, not just by being engaging, but by outright taking control of the exchange. For Carson, this wasn't just annoying, it was a direct challenge to the role he'd mastered over decades. Their personalities clashed on a fundamental level. Carson was understated and reserved, carefully pacing his interviews for maximum entertainment value. His guest was bombastic and prone to confrontation, more comfortable debating than bantering. While Carson could handle strong personalities, this wasn't the kind of tension that made for great television. It was the kind that disrupted the show's rhythm. Despite being in the same industry, or perhaps because of it, the two never seemed fully at ease with one another. Their interactions were marked not by camaraderie, but by subtle power struggles. In the end, it was less like hosting a guest and more like hosting a rival, something Carson had little patience for. Zsa Zsa Gabor. Elegance, drama, and unpredictability. Few guests brought all three to the set, quite like this European-born socialite and actress. Famous for her extravagant lifestyle and diva persona, she made headlines wherever she went. But when she appeared on The Tonight Show, her larger-than-life personality often clashed with Johnny Carson's more controlled and conversational style. From the moment she walked on stage, it was clear she wanted to be the center of attention. She spoke loudly, interrupted often, and rarely stayed on topic. Carson, who thrived on clever timing and witty exchanges, found it difficult to build a rhythm with her. She had no interest in being set up for a punchline. She was delivering her own, whether they landed or not. What made matters worse was her inability, or unwillingness, to laugh at herself. Carson's humor often relied on a light tease or self-deprecating jab. But this guest didn't take kindly to being the butt of any joke. Instead of playing along, she pushed back, often defensively. What was meant to be playful banter turned into something closer to awkward sparring. She also had a tendency to hijack the conversation. Carson would ask a question, and she'd answer with a meandering monologue, sometimes about topics completely unrelated. For a host who valued structure and timing, this created dead spots, moments that felt more like stalling than entertaining. Viewers may have been intrigued by her glamour and unpredictability, But for Carson, each appearance felt like a balancing act on a high wire. He had to stay polite, keep the show moving, and avoid setting off any emotional landmines, all while still trying to be funny. She was a spectacle, no doubt. But Carson wasn't looking for spectacle. He was looking for a guest who knew when to share the spotlight. Norman Mailer. Hosting a controversial novelist with a sharp tongue and a sharper ego is always a gamble. And when one such figure appeared on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson quickly realized how high the stakes could be. He was a brilliant writer, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and a frequent provocateur. But he was also, by most accounts, one of the most difficult guests Carson ever faced. Carson liked to keep his interviews light, witty, and entertaining. This guest, however, thrived on confrontation. He didn't just answer questions, he challenged them. He turned simple prompts into intellectual debates, often shifting the tone from playful to combative in seconds. For Carson, who carefully curated each segment for flow and timing, this kind of disruption was a nightmare. There was also the matter of airtime. This guest had a habit of monopolizing the conversation, talking at length without pause. While some audiences appreciated his bravado and brilliance, many sensed the tension building beneath Carson's smile. It was obvious he was working overtime to keep things from spiraling. What made things more difficult was the guest's disdain for traditional decorum. He didn't play the late-night game. He challenged it. He'd veer into polarizing topics like politics, gender, or society's moral decay. That might have worked in a lecture hall or literary roundtable, but it clashed with the light, escapist world Carson had created for his viewers. Carson wasn't easily rattled, but with this guest, he often looked like he wanted the segment to end before it even began. There was no rhythm, no rapport, just friction disguised as conversation. Two men with vastly different goals sharing a stage, and only one of them seemed to know it was supposed to be fun. Tony Curtis. There are guests who bring charisma, and then there are guests who try to steal the show. Few actors embodied that more than this Hollywood heartthrob, whose charm was undeniable, but whose presence on The Tonight Show often left Johnny Carson visibly drained. A true movie star of the golden age, he had the stories, the energy, and the personality to light up any room. But when he sat across from Carson, he often did too much. Rather than engage in an easygoing back and forth, he launched into long, winding tales about his career, his relationships, and his glory days. These weren't tight anecdotes crafted for laughs. They were monologues, sometimes meandering and self-indulgent. Carson, who prided himself on keeping the show snappy and entertaining, struggled to rein him in. The interruptions were rare, not because Carson wasn't trying, but because there was no room to jump in. This guest dominated the couch, often turning what should have been a conversation into a solo act. There was also a performative edge to his appearances. Everything he said was framed to reinforce his image as a Hollywood legend. It wasn't about connecting, it was about impressing. And for Carson, who preferred guests that didn't take themselves too seriously, this constant self-promotion became tiresome. While Carson was always professional on air, those close to the production noted the subtle signs: tight smiles, shortened segments, fewer return invitations. It wasn't hostility, but it was clear. Carson didn't enjoy playing second fiddle on his own show. He wanted charm, not ego, stories, not lectures. And when the guest couldn't or wouldn't make room for anyone else, the interview stopped being fun and started feeling like a performance Carson hadn't signed up for. Don Rickles. Most guests who tested Johnny Carson's patience did so unintentionally. This one, however, made chaos his signature and somehow got away with it. As one of the most iconic insult comics of all time, he brought wild energy, fast-paced jabs, and a total disregard for structure every time he appeared on The Tonight Show. Carson admired him, no doubt, but that didn't mean he always enjoyed having him on. From the moment Rickles hit the stage, the show's format went out the window. He'd interrupt, mock, and wander off script, sometimes literally. He'd get up from his chair, interact with the audience, or target members of the crew with his trademark roast-style comedy. Carson, who was known for precise timing and keeping things running smoothly, often found himself caught in Rickles' whirlwind. One legendary moment captured the nature of their relationship perfectly. Rickles broke Carson's cigarette box while guest hosting the show. The next day, Carson stormed the set of Rickles' sitcom, CPO Sharky, to confront him, on camera. The bit became comedy gold, but behind the scenes, it was clear. Rickles was both beloved and exhausting. The real tension came from Rickles' relentless teasing. Most guests deferred to Carson's authority. Rickles bulldozed it. His jabs often hit uncomfortably close to home, especially when they touched on Carson's personal life, topics he rarely discussed publicly. While Carson played along, you could sometimes see the flicker of discomfort behind the laughter. Still, despite the chaos, there was a deep mutual respect. Rickles was one of the few who could get away with pushing Carson's buttons and still be invited back. But make no mistake, each appearance was a gamble. Hilarious, often, predictable, never. And for Carson, unpredictability was both the magic and the migraine. Muhammad Ali. Some guests had star power, others had presence, but very few had both in the way this heavyweight champion did. Whenever he appeared on The Tonight Show, it was a spectacle. He was charming, witty, and endlessly quotable. But for Johnny Carson, those interviews weren't always easy. Behind the playful smiles, there was a subtle struggle for control. Ali wasn't just an athlete. He was a global icon, a political voice, and a cultural lightning rod. He didn't shrink to fit the late-night mold. When he spoke, the room listened, and Carson often found himself adjusting just to keep up. The usual rhythm of give and take didn't apply here. Ali would seize the moment, talk at length, and command the stage with the confidence of a man who knew he was bigger than the format. Carson admired Ali's charisma, but their interactions occasionally became tense. Ali's boldness sometimes edged into confrontation, especially when discussing issues like race, war, or religion. He could be serious one minute, joking the next, and back to serious again without warning. Carson, who preferred a smoother, more measured tone, had trouble finding balance in these interviews. There were moments of brilliance, genuine laughter, sharp comebacks, and deep respect. But there were also stretches where Carson looked visibly uncomfortable, unsure of how to respond without derailing the energy or stepping into controversy. Ali wasn't trying to be difficult. He was just being himself, unfiltered, unapologetic, and utterly magnetic. But that magnetism didn't always leave space for Carson to do what he did best. Behind the desk, Carson thrived on control. Across from him, Ali thrived on being uncontrollable. And that fundamental difference made their time together compelling, but undeniably uneasy. Mae West. When it came to commanding attention, few guests did it with as much flair, or as much controversy, as this silver screen legend. By the time she appeared on The Tonight Show, her career had already spanned decades, and her reputation for risque innuendo and bold sexuality preceded her. Johnny Carson, known for his reserved charm and precise comedic rhythm, found himself walking a tightrope every time she visited. She didn't follow the typical playbook for late-night guests. While most came to chat, she came to perform. Flirtatious and provocative, she turned interviews into suggestive exchanges, lacing nearly every line with double meaning. For Carson, who liked to keep things playful but within certain boundaries, the interviews quickly became awkward exercises in restraint. Every question he asked was met with a wink, a purr, or a veiled proposition. What might have seemed harmless on paper came across on air as jarringly forward, especially for a host who built his legacy on smart, subtle timing. The audience often roared with laughter, but Carson's body language told a different story. He was visibly uneasy, unsure of how far the conversation might go, or how to pull it back when it crossed the line. It wasn't that he didn't respect her. She was a Hollywood icon after all, but her refusal to tone it down or play along within the show's rhythm left Carson off balance. He couldn't tease, couldn't steer, and couldn't rely on his usual bag of tricks. What was supposed to be a 5-minute chat often felt like a test of how long he could keep smiling through discomfort. And while her appearances were unforgettable, they were far from Carson's favorite. With her, the spotlight burned a little too hot, even for a host who lived under its glare. Johnny Carson may have made it look easy, but behind that iconic desk sat a man who navigated the egos, quirks, and chaos of showbiz with a steady hand. Still, as we've seen, even Johnny had his limits. Whether it was the overly scripted Bob Hope, the fiery feud with Joan Rivers, or chaotic visits from Don Rickles, each guest left a mark, not just on Carson, but on late-night TV history. These moments remind us that even legends have boundaries. Now, we want to hear from you. Which guest shocked you the most? Were you surprised by who made the list? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of television's greatest hosts, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a story from the golden age of Hollywood.